Well, it was very funny going to the Languages Institute. It was a bit like going back to primary school because your life was very regulated. You know, you went to class in the morning and then at the break time you had to go out and do the exercises. Da, 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 da. Everyone sort of, you know, did their star jumps and stuff like that. And then in the afternoons, most afternoons, in the Languages Institute at least, you were occupied with, there were things like we did laodong, manual labour, because it was important that we too should understand, you know, the dignity of the masses. And we used to quite kind of laugh about it because, I mean, some of the manual labour consisted of shoveling rubble. There was what had once been a tennis court, I believe, in the Languages Institute. And, you know, before Tuesday afternoon, a heap of rubble would appear on the tennis court and we would shovel it away, only for a very similar looking pile of rubble to arrive next Tuesday because it was manual labour time again. And we used to think about writing our names on the bricks and seeing if we could find one that turned up. I mean, when we got to Beidao, we did bits of manual labour too, and we did things like we gloriously dug some of the underground shelters, which were there to protect Beidao students against nuclear attack. I mean, they were only about 2 feet underground, but we set off, and that was night digging, and so it was very heroic. You know, we set off at 6 p.m. with our shovels and dug for a bit, and then we had a large meal, and then we went to bed. But and we made railway engines. We went to the big railway factory where other people were making railway engines and we kind of stood about. And I always remember there were some terribly serious foreign students. I mean, they were much more serious than me. There was a guy who now I think is professor in Heidelberg or something like that. And we used to sort of sometimes get together. We were supposed to sort of get together and what have you learnt today from the manual labour and from working with these wonderful workers. And I remember this guy, Rudolf, who was German, taking out a very small piece of paper, and he said, I asked my Shifu, which was the person sort of in charge of the machine, whether she, I was trying to follow his notes, had a television. And she said, and we all knew what she was going to say, she said no. And so we learnt from the masses that they didn't have televisions. I mean, in those days you wouldn't much wanted a television because there was nothing much on. I mean, as students, I suppose, in those days, I mean, things like the cinema was of no interest whatsoever. You know, there might be an old North Korean film, but nothing, you know, television was not interesting. Eating was still, at least, that was something that you could do. We went every weekend, we would go to different restaurants and eat very well. And also, we kind of worked out ways of living within the confines of the foreign community of Beijing, that in the friendship store, which was intended for foreign diplomats, that we were allowed into, you could buy little loaves of brown bread, which were very nice, and you could also buy caviar by the jam jar. Now this came from the Amur Usuri. I mean, it comes from the right place, it's the real thing. But because China and Russia hadn't been speaking to each other for a very long time, this was just, I mean, it was the price of Marmite. And so for Sunday breakfasts, we used to grind coffee, have real coffee, which was again difficult. We had to go to Tianjin to get that. Grind our coffee beans and then have brown bread with caviar, which was absolutely fantastic. I mean, I fear now that caviar has gone up in price, but for quite a long time actually, through the 70s, caviar from the friendship store was, you know, as I say, cheap as fish paste. I mean, it was fantastic. 75 into 76 was a really, really tense time in China. Because people were getting old, people were beginning to die. I mean, one of the worst moments was when Zhou Enlai died in January 76, because it was quite clear that the entire country was really panicky. You know, because Zhou Enlai, who was obviously a terribly interesting figure, one would love to know really, really what he was about. But to most people, he was the kind of peacemaker, and they felt that, you know, they trusted him and that he would look after them, and that, you know, it was true, I think, that if there were riots in Hangzhou, you just had to send Zhou Enlai, and as soon as they saw him standing on the steps of the aeroplane, you know, they'd stop. I mean, he was trusted, and then he goes, and who have they got between them and, you know, the increasingly weird people around Chairman Mao. So that was awful, because I mean, for a whole couple of weeks, the whole country was in a frenzy of mourning. And you did have too, all the time, the sense that people were restless as well. That, you know, their standard of living had not changed, had not risen for a very long time, and they were beginning to accumulate money, but there was nothing to spend it on. So there was a sense of, you know, dissatisfaction. And then it got worse and worse, I suppose, as the year went on. I mean, it became apparent that Chairman Mao was not really capable of saying anything much. I mean, there was an interview on television between him and Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, and you could see Lee Kuan Yew trying to understand what was being mumbled at him. But that was the last time Mao appeared on television, and it got more and more tense. And I remember in the summer when suddenly we heard the funeral music, and everyone stopped in Beidar campus. I mean, really stood still. And you just heard the music, but no one had heard the announcement that preceded it. So everyone's saying things like, did you hear, you know, did you hear who it was? And so on. And actually, poor old Zhu De, it was actually for them a relief that it was Zhu De, because they were frightened that it was Mao, and that was going to be a kind of cataclysm. I mean, that didn't happen until just after I'd got home, about 2 weeks after I'd got home from China. But you knew that the country was tense, nervous, and on the brink of all sorts of things. Well, I mean, I think coming back from China after a year is very odd. You do feel very, very strange. I remember sitting on a bus and feeling that everyone was hostile, and then I realised it wasn't that they were hostile, it was just that they weren't sort of paying attention to me as a foreigner. You know, I was used to people all sort of saying, oh, where do you come from, what do you do, you know, and kind of engaging with you. They're just being English and sitting on a bus, and somehow it felt like hostility. And also things like, God, the consumerism was just ridiculous. I mean, you know, a choice of, you know, 3 cereals for breakfast. To go to a supermarket, there's a choice of about 27 cereals for breakfast. You know, I was used to China where there was one thing, one pair of trousers, one shirt, you know, and no choice. And it was quite restful actually in China, having this no choice. I mean, I felt that Oxford Street was crazy. I also got very good at living without central heating, all sorts of things like that. But you know, so I missed it quite a lot in many ways. But then, of course, there was the complication that, I mean, about sort of 2 weeks after I got home, Mao died, and you know, all of a sudden, the last 10 years have been a mistake. You know, and everything, we'd stood out there in the snow copying down big character posters, all attacking Deng Xiaoping and stuff. And then he's the man of the moment. It was a kind of. So you had to adjust to that, the fact that our great experience in China was, as it were, an abnormality. It was not the real thing.